It's a cluster. Hello ladies and gentlemen, and who could have predicted it? 2 novels set in the Edwardian period in a row, because welcome to my review of Michael Moorcock's The Warlord of the Air. Though this is a 1971 novel, this edition comes from 1981, and with this being an alternative history, that is fairly significant because some editions make clever references to actual historical figures. In this edition, a character named after Enoch Powell is just referred to as Major Howell, and the character Reagan, a most unflattering depiction, is called Egan here. Let's get into the plot, and as usual you can slide the timer to the point indicated on the screen to avoid this part, but do not consider the rest of this video spoiler free. It's very unlikely to be so. The text comes with a brief introduction saying it was written by Michael Moorcock's grandfather, also called Michael Moorcock, who suffered from exhaustion and decided to relax a little in the more distant parts of the British Empire, this being set initially in 1903, 2 years after the death of Queen Victoria. Moorcock meets Oswald Bastable as he is ejected from a ship, apparently as a stowaway. The narrator then switches to Bastable as he tells his tale, beginning in Nepal, where he was a middling officer in the British Army and with a company of soldiers was sent into the mountains where a cult under the High Priest Sharon Kang has killed some of the British garrison. This is not explicitly a punitive mission, more a fact-finding show of force. Kang invites Bastable and his retinue to the temple for lunch, which is clearly drugged, and in a scramble to escape, Bastable ends up alone in the depths of the temple as it all begins crashing down around him. He wakes up, his clothes in ruins, and climbs from the rubble to find the temple has been utterly destroyed. Above him is an enormous airship, which he attracts the attention of and finds it is a British exploration ship. He also learns that it is now 1973, which would have been 2 years into Moorcock's future at the time of writing. However, it is clearly an alternative history. The British Empire is going swimmingly, old chap, what-ho, and so are the empires of the Japanese, Russians, French and Americans, which includes Vietnam, highly topical in the 1970s. The backbone of all the empires is the trade and travel made possible by fleets of enormous airships. Bastable is introduced to a land that seems to him a utopia. Even the remote regions of India have been highly anglicised. However, there are a number of terrorist attacks being reported, surprising to the clueless Bastable, but obviously a sign that the veneer of civilization only covers so much, the rewards of empire only distributed to so many. Feigning amnesia to ward off unwanted questions, Bastable joins the newly formed air police to keep order on a luxury liner. However, he loses his temper with a passenger called Egan who causes enough trouble that Bastable eventually beats him to within an inch of his life. Drummed out of the police and desperate for work, he falls in with another crew, this one of a freighter under the command of Korzeniowski. He discovers the crew are mostly anarchists, but his attempts to warn the authorities are unsuccessful, and the ship then falls under the command of General O.T. Shaw, the warlord of the title, who is a communist fighting to free China from the oppression of the Russian and Japanese empires and blaming the British for most of his plight. Bastable is taken to Shaw's base in China, a city called New Dawn in English, which is portrayed as a utopia whose communist ideals have attracted radical thinkers from all around the various empires who are now working together and have given it an unrivaled technological advantage. As such, when the imperial powers move on the city, they can hold them off quite easily. However, the fighting cannot go on indefinitely, and Shaw's secret NFB project is prepared to end things once and for all by destroying the airport of Hiroshima, which all the imperial powers are using as their base for the attack on shore. Bastable is to command the airship during the attack, considering it near to suicide when it is actual suicide, but for some baffling reason, Shaw and all his friends decide to come along as well. The bomb goes off and Bastable is catapulted back in time, where he meets Moorcock, relates his story and concludes that this is 1903, but it is not his 1903, and then he disappears. Moorcock looks for him unsuccessfully for a little while before Moorcock Jr. relates that his grandfather was killed on the Somme in 1916. It seems that Michael Moorcock was not the name of the author's grandfather, though beyond that I don't know anything about him. But if none of the epilogue is factual, it leaves a fairly bad taste in the mouth. Perhaps this is itself some sort of weird time jump that the sequels will develop, perhaps not. But if it is just a cynical ploy to try and gain some gravitas for a book like this, it's not one I particularly like, if I'm honest. Though it didn't sour me on the story itself, because it is, as I said, the postscript or epilogue if you prefer. And more importantly, because the story had already soured me on it by its own lack of intrigue, pace and dimension. The latter being, this is an overtly political novel, but where it is possible to read something like Heinlein, for example, especially in his golden period, and just enjoy the story without even picking up on the message, here it is not. Because there is no great story, nor anything particularly new or unusual. Alternate history stories were not new in 1971, nor were alternate dimensions or time-travelling stories. The only originality on display here, as far as I can tell, is the adoption of the airships as the primary means of travel and oppression. Given that naval superiority was the backbone of empire in Moorcock's lifetime, and the explosion in air travel that had happened during the previous 50 or 60 years, it's hardly a great leap of genius either. The novel being set in 1903, generally accepted as the year the Wright brothers invented manned flight, is clearly significant too. The airships themselves, though, are magnificent, and the description given to their features and operation would, again, not be out of place in Heinlein's work. Bastable's ore is well translated to the reader, and the technology seems to be set up as one of the frontrunners of the steampunk movement, though I'm by no means an expert in that genre. But the anti-imperial message is too on the nose, and the British Empire was, for all intents and purposes, over at this time. We could barely keep the lights on at home in the 1970s, let alone tell anyone else what to do. The job of policing the world, of expanding a de facto empire culturally, economically and militarily, seemed after Suez to have transferred to the Americans. Perhaps with his clear condemnation of empire, Moorcock intended this as a warning to the Americans. Because if it was a suggestion that the French and English ought to dismantle theirs, it was rather late, and Vietnam was already serving as a far better warning to the Americans than 1,000 books like this ever would. After revealing the utopia of the British Empire to be a sham, the narrative moves to the Chinese new dawn of O.T. Shaw, and the politicising begins in earnest. I really can't tell if Moorcock was being serious or not in promoting the communist encampment with its fountains and rose gardens and multiracial children playing at voice-activated doors as a real utopia. Surely the ever-listening something like a milky blue surface, which was oval in shape and unidentifiable, which serves all of Bastable's needs during his incarceration in the camp, is obviously comparable with Winston's oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror. Similarly, Shaw says that when he has enough air power, presumably to deliver the NFB, and after the Chinese Revolution takes hold in the rest of the world and its empires, he will not need his military for much longer. Yet he acknowledges that they only follow him because he's the most effective bandit, and any attempts to discipline his troops will end up with them cutting his throat. Something tells me this communist utopia will be a military dictatorship as soon as he tries to disband them. Additionally, he claims his army is a democratic one, his excuse for the death of Barry, who was on their side. It's a clusterfuck based on doublethink like this moment of absolute genius. We would be economically stronger than Europe. That would be a true balance of power. Somebody buy this man a dictionary, but the mask of statesmanship slips in the next line. Then you'd see what justice is all about, how quickly the oppressed assume the trappings of the tyrant. Here, it's before they've even won. Orwell said that after a revolution, the revolutionaries should kill their leaders, but Shaw's plan seems to be coming at it the other way. Try to disband a military you can barely control anyway, and what do you do? Who do you turn to when they refuse? Heinlein's utopia, found in Starship Troopers, separated the wolves from the sheep, and the wolves ruled. Moorcock seems to suggest the sheep can rule the wolves in this passage. Does he notice that the China for the Chinese rhetoric makes no sense when Shaw's utopia is so overtly and deliberately multiracial? And if the city is socialist, doesn't their China first, foreigners out rhetoric come close to National Socialism? Though Shaw prefers the term communist, and I guess national communism could be a new thing. What could possibly go wrong? Shaw calls himself a warlord. On the same page he claims his society is democratic, and you have to assume that Moorcock can see through this nonsense, but Bastable doesn't, and isn't intended to. Like Johnny Rico, he's there to receive and consume the message, vicariously learning the author's message for the reader. The once strident imperialist is soon happy to sacrifice himself for the cause. O'Brien would be proud. It's possible to read the best books and enjoy their story regardless of the author's message, ideally like 1984 or Heinlein's Puppet Masters or even Starship Troopers, to enjoy both, even if you don't wholeheartedly agree. But there's nothing to Warlord of the Air. The battle over China could have been something epic. It probably should have been, but it's over in a flash. At least, though, Shaw's needless sacrifice of his own ships demonstrates a Stalin-esque concern for their lives. At last, a realistic answer to the question of how he intends to rid himself of his military. But you can't mention Stalin without mentioning Lenin, who turns up in Shaw's camp. He would have been 103 in 1973, but he's sprightly for it. Even though the youngsters humour him rather than respect him, they respect his writing, saying it will inspire each new generation of revolutionaries, questioning what sort of utopia they're going to be building if it's still going to need to be overthrown by revolutionaries. But what our band of heroic national communists doesn't need is an anti-Semite, and Lenin's outbursts on that score are at least disapproved of a little. Bastable starts as a fairly decent army officer. He listens to his local commanders and adapts according to their advice, though he follows Kang to a city in what is likely to be a trap. His orders from above rather dictate that he has little choice but to try and find a diplomatic answer. Unnerved, of course, by travelling back in time, he handles it in a thoughtful way, realising that excessive protesting of the truth would likely end up with him in an institution of some kind. He plays the doctors, calculating the most likely favourable outcome. His violence towards Egan is somewhat out of character, but he is provoked and somewhat justifies his actions. His pro-imperial mindset, though, is a little bit silly, but again, overawed by the sights and sounds of the future as he sees it, and being ex-military is fairly understandable. His conversion to the Shaw cause comes under fire. It's a shame it's not handled more subtly and given time to develop rather than a couple of propaganda films and a few nights in the most comfortable of gulags. Moorcock was likely in a hurry to bash out these books in order to pay for the floundering sci-fi magazine he was editor of at the time, but his novel works best as a slow burner. The beginning, with Bastable's sense of wonder and the steampunk stylings, make this a pretty decent alternative history novel, but there's no intrigue behind the statement Empire is bad for the colonies, and there wasn't in 1971 either. The memory of too many fights for independence would have been too new. So the intrigue has to be those bombings building to a climax. But when it comes to two occasions, Shaw capturing the airship and Shaw's men fighting off the Imperial attack, Bastable is locked away as a prisoner, playing no part. He doesn't learn for himself the truth about Empire, that the facade is propped up by oppression and mistreatment. Shaw shows him a single propaganda film that reduces him to tears. There's a lack of agency from Bastable, an army commander where it matters. He can work and plan the best scenario for his personal story, but takes no interest beyond condemning the bad things that are happening, even when they're getting closer and closer. His failure to properly handle the anarchists on the ship becomes confusing. When joining the ship in Croydon, security is non-existent. So surely in the colonial outposts he would have had the opportunity to leave the ship and alert security, but if he did, then the rest of the plot couldn't happen, and thereafter Bastable reads more and more like a child, and the book doesn't so much as rush towards an ending as lurch to it, with far too much time given to Sean's waffling and Bastable's acceptance of his futuristic city as a utopia. One of the highlights of Elric was the action, with Moorcock's lean style lending itself to a fast-paced back and forth. The action here instead left me feeling short-changed. The Imperial Armada attacks and the whole thing is over in 2 pages, at least half of one devoted to Bastable's mourning of Korzeniowski. There's little sense of a build-up beyond a fairly decent description of the fleet as it approaches, but the structure of the novel, despite Bastable's doubts, makes it clear what the outcome will be, making Shaw's decision to waste half of his fleet for no real gain all the more bizarre. Moorcock could have built up the danger. What is the NFB? What might happen if it fell into their hands? Perhaps put Bastable in one of the little fighters, giving immediacy to the air combat. Time pressure, such as the approaching bombers that are hard to kill, Shaw's forces having to devise a way to stop them on the hoof. Instead, we know already that the little fighters will make short work of the airships. It's just so disappointing, especially after wading through 30 pages of political hectoring to get to it. In conclusion, after a pretty good first half, a steampunk style and intriguing opening soon gives way to lengthy political lecturing. The intrigue hinted at in the first handful of scenes is lost when Bastable seems to be able to adopt a long-term vision to his own position, even 70 years removed from his time, but can't see beyond his nose what is happening in the world around him. His violence towards Egan seems out of character, his incompetence at handling the security of his second ship weak or bizarre. Both contradict the established depiction of him in the opening. somewhat understandable in that he becomes a fish out of water. Yet he also claims to be that in the opening scene, where he still operates far more capably. As a steampunk prototype, the parts of the novel devoted to the airship works well, and in a Heinleinian way seem everyday and functional. Even in a novel as short as this, it is effective. The political hectoring that forms the bulk of the third act sucks life and joy from a plot that was already on the pedestrian and sober side. If it was intended as a parody of texts that wear their politics on the sleeves, like Starship Troopers for example, I'd recommend Harry Harrison's over this every day of the week. But it isn't written overtly in that way, and instead seems like an attempt to dress up a political pamphlet in a sci-fi skin. Not the first time that that's been done, but it's usually done better. The debt to Burroughs and Wells is clear, but one suspects Moorcock is happier to borrow from both than he is to repay the debt once he's taken it on. Instead, his text almost feels like an attempt to retake political ground lost in 1984, but the battle of minds between Orwell and Moorcock would be rather like trying to fight a tank with a 1980s Star Blaster. The worst thing about this book, and everything else is far more forgivable, is that it's barely 150 pages long and it still manages to be boring. Recommended only to people who read it in their youth and are still nostalgic for it, or those who think they can find thoughtful political discussion on Twitter. Everyone else should try any of the other novels mentioned in the course of this video first. Thank you for listening this long. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to click like and subscribe if you haven't already, and if you didn't like it, well, there's nothing much I can do apart from recommend my review of Elric, which I enjoyed rather more. See you in the next video. Bye.